In a previous video, I discussed the brutal life of being a referee, as they are expected to absolutely be perfect when making close and tough calls, or else they will absolutely be berated with hate and disdain. Players and coaches will openly let the referees know they got a call wrong from their perspective, but it's never really a polite conversation. Professional sports are extremely competitive and consequential, as one bad call from a referee can affect the outcome of a game, season, or even a championship. So it seems pretty expected when players and coaches are outraged when an official makes a call they don't like so much that they sometimes take on a hostile attitude. It's mentally brutal for players and coaches when the only thing standing in their way from a win is a controversial call from a scrawny referee. But when the players and coaches step a bit too far across a line, referees have a special power to discipline them. If necessary, referees can kick out players and coaches from a game. This is called an ejection. Ejections can occur in many circumstances, like arguing a call you're not supposed to argue, two technical fouls in basketball, illegal hits and blocks like in football, soccer, and hockey, unsportsmanlike conducts, and fighting. Ejections can be quite consequential, as one could be liable for suspension from one or more games for their actions. Ejections can be extremely irritating to the players and coaches, but they can also be entertaining to the spectators, since they don't happen often. But what if I told you one sport does have ejections more often than any other sport? You may be surprised, as the answer to that question is baseball. That's right, baseball is the king of ejections, as in the 2019 season, there were 217 ejections, compared to the NBA's 71 in the 2018 and 19 season, the MLS 61 in 2019, and the NFL's 23 in 2020. That's quite a lot more. So why are there so many in baseball? Why do all the other sports have so much less? Well, let's take a look. Baseball. It's our national pastime, but not to everybody. You probably either find baseball to be a very interesting, fun, and thrilling game to play and watch, or you think it's the most boring sport in the world. I could agree with both of those statements. With generally how the game is played, it can really put people to sleep, but if you're patient enough, you might find some exciting moments and events. There's 400-foot long home runs, spectacular fielding plays, stealing bases, and more. But the most fascinating things in baseball that could wake you up just might be fighting and ejections. I talked about the art of fights in baseball in a previous video, so go check that out if you please. So then we're just left with ejections. Again, ejections mean the umpire forces players and or coaches out of the game with a quick finger up and a flick of the wrist. It's quite a dramatic and sometimes funny process of how people get ejected in baseball. Initially, the umpire makes a controversial or even a wrong call on a certain play, which stirs up players and coaches on one team. You'll always see some jawing and trash talking from the team, which the umpire can ignore, but they don't have to. In MLB rules, the league gives umpires quite a bit of power, as most objections can be subject to immediate ejection. So, if an umpire thinks you're being a little mean by saying they made a bad call, the umpire can throw you out of the game, just like that. This can be absolutely infuriating to the team, as they don't believe they should be disqualified from a game due to a very short fuse or lack of some thick skin. What proceeds is where the entertainment begins. Once a player or coach is ejected, they continue to ferociously argue with the umpire, as nothing is really stopping them from leaving since they've already been ejected. This is called getting their money's worth, as fellow teammates, coaches, or other umpires try to escort them back to the dugout to prevent them from doing any more damage. There are many examples of ludicrous and hilarious post-ejection fits, like manager Lloyd McClendon literally stealing a base from the field and taking it back to the clubhouse, Lou Piniella kicking dirt on umpires, and even a minor league manager covering up dirt on home plate throwing bases around the field, and crawling behind the mound while grenade tossing a rosin bag all the way to the umpire. These are surely fun to see and definitely get people out of their seats, but they can surely get out of hand and unnecessary sometimes, like how Brett Lowry literally threw his helmet at an umpire after a bad call. I'm sure this is what a lot of players and coaches think when umpires get a call wrong, but they are held back knowing they'll surely get a hefty fine and a suspension, and no one wants to do that. So even with the potential threat of fines and suspensions, why are there still so many ejections in baseball? The answer is obvious and a bit complicated as well. It's the umpires for sure, but it's the discretionary calls they have to make that really piss people off. Discretionary calls just mean it's up to their judgment to make the call without other influence. Most calls in baseball are discretionary, but due to the implementation of instant replay challenges in 2014, umpires really only have to make their judgment based on balls and strikes, balks, fair or foul balls, check swings, interference, and some others. It would lead to a complicated mess if all plays were reviewable, so players are forced to respect the decisions of the umpire. If the players argue non-reviewable calls, they are subject to immediate ejection according to the league. This is extra frustrating for teams, as even if the umpires are dead wrong on their calls, the teams will be the ones punished for arguing the calls. The umpire is always right. The discretion of balls and strikes is the main culprit here of what causes so many ejections. With the advancement of technology in sports, as you can see the strike zone on TV and other devices, teams have much higher expectations of umpires making calls. The problem is, it's virtually impossible to get 100% of balls and strike calls right, as umpires have to make millimeter-long decisions, which are extremely hard to judge with the naked eye, and 90-mile-an-hour pitches. However, there are plenty of times where umpires make god-awful calls that are obviously strikes or balls. The anger from those calls are surely justified, as it seems anyone can make those calls. So non-reviewable calls are frustrating sometimes, but what about reviewable calls? You would think the implementation of the instant replay would decrease the number of ejections each year, right? Actually, no. Before instant replay, umpires had to make every call on their own without replay, with the occasional meeting of all the umpires to make a decision. Ejections would be very apparent when umpires would make close calls at one of the bases for an out or safe call. These were insanely irritating, as bad calls ruined games for many players and teams. Finally, the instant replay challenge was implemented in 2014. However, there's been no significant decrease in ejections. There have still been years where there were more ejections in one year than years before the replay rule. Doesn't this seem contradictory? Quite so, but there may be a couple of reasons that explain this. One might be simply higher expectations. Like I said before, technology in sports have vastly improved with replay, high-definition quality, and several more camera angles. Players have tablets or TVs in their own dugouts that can show them their at-bats where the umpire made a bad call, and can immediately complain about that. Before this technology, players unfortunately just had to deal with bad or close calls, since they couldn't really tell for sure whether it was the right or wrong call. Today, players, coaches, and viewers can easily see if every call is wrong or right, making it that much easier to judge umpires these days. A second reason for the same number of ejections may be disputing the results of the replay review. When a team challenges a reviewable call, the umpires actually don't make the call. Rather, the league office in New York makes the call, as they monitor every game with every possible camera angle. The umpires wear a headset where the replay people in New York relay their decision, then the umpires show the call to the teams. Seems pretty straightforward and fair, but sometimes even the league replay office may make controversial or even wrong decisions. Since the higher-ups make the call, arguing the decision of the replay is also forbidden and is immediately subject to an ejection. Sometimes the players or coaches arguing the call are wrong too, as the replay office usually gets the call right. but there's always situations that make teams skeptical of the calls. These ejections from disputes actually replace the number of ejections from safer out calls with the same or even higher number. In 2013, safe and out calls were the leading source of ejections with 22, followed of course by balls and strikes with 21. The next year, with the replay system intact, balls and strikes became the leading source of ejections with 32, followed by disputed results of replay with 23. This may be our answer to why the number of ejections hasn't really changed even with a replay, because disputing the replay just replaced the safe and out statistic. And balls and strikes ejections increased as technology increased, possibly showing some higher expectations for umpires. So, with ejections still on the rise, is there really an answer to try and decrease them? There still might be. One could just be tolerating the decisions of umpires, but of course we all know that's not happening. A debate that's gaining momentum is whether the MLB should implement robot umpires to call balls and strikes. Since most TV broadcasts show a strike zone and where a pitch lands on the screen, it would seem to make sense if the league could do the same, but actually in place for the home plate umpire. Critics have claimed this takes the human element out of the game, but supporters have mentioned each pitch can deeply affect each at-bat, which could affect the score, which could affect the game, and which could affect the season. It seems quite consequential to teams to let the human eye make those close calls. Robot umpires are currently being experimented in other leagues, and just might make the scene in this decade. This way just might be the strategy to decrease ejections, but as we saw with replay, this might not be the case. Time will tell. As I said earlier, the MLB had 217 ejections in 2019, so one might ask, why don't other sports have as many or more ejections than baseball? Let's take a look at each major sport. First, the NBA is the runner-up to baseball, with 71 ejections in the 2018 and 19 season. In a previous video, I talked about the difficulty of officiating in basketball, as almost every call is discretionary and close. Referees have to make quick decisions during fierce and competitive play, which takes quite a toll on players. There is a challenge system, but it only allows one challenge per game, which makes it harder for teams to decide whether the call is worth it to challenge. The technology factor like we saw in baseball might be applicable here in the NBA, as the amount of high-definition camera angles is so much higher than in the past, making it easier for everyone to see if a call was right or not. This may cause players and coaches to have even higher expectations of referees, just like in baseball. But shouldn't that increase ejections? Maybe, maybe not. In basketball, when players argue, the referees cut them some slack, but when they say the magic words, they are given a technical foul, which is essentially a warning before they get ejected. Technical fouls are quite effective at disciplining players, as they know if they get 2 technicals, then they'll be ejected. So they have to tread carefully after the first one, which probably ends up decreasing the chances of ejection. The flagrant 2 foul is also a way of immediate ejection. A flagrant 2 is when a player makes very aggressive and unnecessary contact with another player, like elbowing or kicking. These are quite rare, however, as players are disciplined well in these actions, and most aggressive contact scenarios are usually only called a flagrant 1. The other way of ejection is obviously fighting. Fighting can be quite vicious in basketball, but they're not as common today than back in the day, as most players in the league have good relationships with each other and are usually friends. Also compared with the 82-game NBA season with a 162-game MLB season, ejections are not as likely in basketball. Next, we have the NFL. There are much less ejections in the NFL for a few reasons. One, discretionary calls are pretty easy to make in the NFL, and a good amount of plays are reviewable, so there isn't too much arguing with the refs. But we for sure have seen moments in the NFL where the refs and replay reviewers got some plays terribly wrong. 2, the main way you'd be ejected from a game in the NFL is illegal hits and unsportsmanlike conduct. The NFL is ensuring illegal hits are enforced, especially hits to the head, as they are no way tolerable. So, illegal hits became the leading cause of ejections in the NFL. Unsportsmanlike conducts aren't too common, as 2 of them will get you ejected, but extreme examples like fighting or hitting the referees will surely get you disqualified. However, since football is literally a game of non-stop aggressive contact, there isn't too much fighting, so ejections from these are relatively rare. For hockey and the NHL, there isn't too much data in ejections due to the fact that ejections are quite rare. NHL officials generally do a pretty good job at making calls, even as most of the calls they make are discretionary, so there isn't too much arguing with officials. Also, like football, hockey is also a game where aggressive contact is allowed. Even fighting won't get you kicked out, and would only result in a 4 or 5 minute penalty for each fighting player. Major fights, like with multiple people, may result in ejections though. The main way hockey players get ejected is through illegal hits to the head, just like football. Finally, there's soccer. To discipline in soccer, referees use color cards to indicate the severity of the play. A yellow card is a more minor infraction of aggressive tackling or arguing with referees. 2 yellow cards will result in the formation of a red card, meaning you are ejected from the game. An immediate red card can also be handed out for very aggressive hits, tackling, fighting, or arguing. These aggressive tackles are quite common in soccer, so yellow cards are not a huge surprise. Nevertheless, the MLS issued 61 red cards in the 2019 season. Each major sport has its clear reasons for ejecting players or coaches, but it seems nothing will ever come close to baseball. Overall, baseball's accumulation of ejections seems quite obvious, as they play 162 2 to 3 hour full-length games each season, meaning they have way more time to cause ejections than most other sports. However, I believe even if you shorten the schedule, ejections would still be more common in baseball. And that was just the case last year, as the MLB shortened the season to 60 games due to the pandemic. Even with these 60 games, umpires dished out 81 ejections, which is still more than the NBA in a full-length season. Baseball is a very consequential sport, as one strike call can drastically affect the mentality of players and coaches, which eventually affects the whole game. Baseball umpires have the hardest job, as they have to deal with players, coaches, and fans who think they can do their job better than theirs. This doesn't help at all, as umpires have to make calls that are distanced by millimeters and invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible on our screens. It's infuriating for teams, as umpires have to make calls that require them to answer immediately without the chance to think, which may cause terrible calls. Players and coaches are bound to argue and are even happy to get ejected, as they stand their ground with the call. Ejections surely add to the entertainment of baseball, but it's difficult to see a future of a decrease of ejections, even with the increase of technology. We may just have to live with all these ejections, and as painful as they are, they're also really fun, and we all just may be fine with that.